before I say anything, I want to know if any of the monstrous students have any questions. Well, I'll ask again in a minute or two. Maybe it'll give you a chance to think of it. Nick, until you tell the story with the extra dials, you say we can just have a robot in the.
You can have a robot right through.
That's the point. So when you have the robot that's there right through, then I think there's nothing wrong with it, except now I think you've added features to your theater that are not playing any role. That because the representations have, now we do have a double transduction.
Well, I mean, why would let's say, okay, the display has now been given this extra dimension appearing to exist in 3D space. It's not a double transaction. It's something which strikes the pilot or the robot observing it as something miraculous and which he wants to talk to everybody about and to do philosophy on and so on, but it's not something which involves a double translation.
Let's see. If this actually is pretty closely parallel to a little thought experiment in Consciousness Explained, where I introduced the Vorsätze.
This isn't the Vorbitzer.
No, this is the Vorsätze. I was inspired by a player piano that's called a Vorsätze, which is a machine which sits at an actual piano and has 88 little levers on it, and it's a way of turning any piano into a player piano. But I wanted to make a Vorsätze for a CAD/CAM machine. So we have a CAD system, and engineers swear by them. They're absolutely wonderful because they can see visually on the screen what they're doing. And now I set myself the task. I'm going to do a little prosthetic device for the disabled. I want to create a CAD system for blind engineers. Now, at this point, we don't need the screen with the phosphor dots or the LEDs at all. What we need is a raster. We need a buffer with zeros and ones in it. We're going to take all the visual processing that a human being would do very easily and naturally, and we're going to have to build a whole perception machine in robotics to look at the screen. But no other. Now we don't have any transduction, any double transduction, because we eliminate the screen and go right from the screen buffer, which is just zeros and ones, to whatever the first level is in the robotic vision system, which is also in zeros and ones. So we have to get rid of the rods and cones, and we have to get rid of the LEDs, and we just, as it were, have to solve the technical problems of how to do that. But once we've done that, then we've got a robot in there. But now, as it were, what is the role of the excitement?
Well, let me say, this comes after this. Hang on. Here's something which also an airplane can have. Now there is something which is actually recording all this information. It's not doing anything with it. It's not integrating it. It's not making plans or whatever it is. It isn't excited in the least. Yeah. Nonetheless, when somebody can pick it up, later on they can possibly recreate what it was like to be the pilot in the plane. But that's my point, Dan. This autopilot or conscious has to do more than that. He can't just be a recorder.
I'm entirely on that. I'm entirely on that.
Okay,
but
so
then we're on the same page.
Yeah,
but then first of all, we've gotten rid of qualia. Because all we have is numbers and registers, just zeros and ones. Now, of course, I'm happy to say that's what qualia turn out to be.
Of course, they turn out to be that at some point, but you haven't got rid of them in any more than say we've got rid of the sight of the moon by saying that's all zeros and ones. This is, the qualia are the way we represent something which is going on in our head through introspection. They are a particular category of representation. Most of our intentional states don't have that quality. Sensations in the different modalities all seem to have this strange, surprising extra dimension. And from the phenomenologists onwards to me writing about the nature of thick time and so on, I try and pick out what the unusual and unexpected qualities of this kind of display. And then, of course, I've gone to build on that and say that when we begin to wonder about these things and puzzled by them, and they become essential to our sense of who we are, what kind of entity we are, how we differ from the rest of the material world ourselves, that then generates ideas about spirituality and everything else, which in my larger story, I say, is actually what's transformed the lives of human beings. But it was there, as perhaps said it must be.
That's earlier.
I'm now the moderator.
Earlier in our life too. It had in the life of animals. Animals too are surprised in some sense by the glories of experience.
I'm all on board with that.
Okay.
So, but Nick, I think that we should let other people explore what you're saying. You and I have been over this ground a lot. We can go over it some more, but let's get others into the act. Dirk is and Jesse.
Let me tell the story. It's partly in terms of this pilot, right? This subject, and then you say, well, you substitute some sort of computer or whatever for the subject. So is the topic of the subject remain eligible? Can it be taken away from the story? Is it just one stage of the story, or does the subject persist all the way, in some sense, all the way to the very bottom level?
Oh no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't go to the bottom level. But you can't take him away at the top because who else is going to get on the radio to the control tower, whatever it is. The subject, among other very important aspects, has direct access to the language system, and therefore that's the person we interact with a great deal, the subject of these sensations. But of course, he's also the subject of volitions and he. Obviously, it's a rather clumsy way to put it. What I want to say is that we have access to a variety of intentional states in our mind. Any intentional state has to have a subject. It doesn't have to be the same subject in principle. There could be a lot of different subjects. Dan and I have written earlier about multiple personality disorder, but I think that's actually the way in which all little children, babies, start life with, in fact, a lot of separate subjects of perception and emotion and pain and everything else, and volition, which actually are not in register at that point. They come into register rather quickly in the course of development because effectively they discover through a neural net in a way that actually they're all on the same project. They're all involved in creating the sort of symphony of the child's life, the project of becoming a human being. And that brings them into register, just as within an orchestra, players who start off playing slightly out of tune and on different instruments and so on, discover that actually they're all working together, and in fact then lots of crosstalk begins to happen to them, and now they're working as a whole to creative work of music. There may be a conductor there. He's probably not needed, but there could be someone in the sense of someone in the conductor's role, not actually controlling all this, but actually observing it all and being there to report when he's asked, why did that happen then? What was the point of this exercise? But the conductor's not needed in a controlling sense.
So is there anything in, say, Dan's story of the subject that you'd want to resist, or is it?
Dan's story of the subject? Well, no, I don't think so. I think Dan and I can agree on what a subject could be without being having to say that it's the idea of an observer is not an oxymoron at all. I think so many people accuse both Dan and me of talking about the conscious subject and being subject to an illusion, and other people saying, well, you can't be subject to an illusion unless you're already conscious of something else, and so on. No, you don't need a series of subjects. One subject can be at the top of the hierarchy here, and it's the one we meet every day in talking to our peers and so on. It's also the one we find in our own lives when we introspect, and whom we hold to be responsible for the decisions we make and so on. It's a very important functional role, but it's exactly the kind of thing you could emulate or simulate, and in fact we do in trying to fly a plane. I mean, these autopilots can also talk to ground control and say what's going on, and where they're going and why they made the mistake and so on.
Andy has a can we sort of disperse?
Yes, I'm looking too much that way.
Yeah. Andy has a question.
Okay, so I've just been trying to get to grips with the sensation-perception distinction. I just want to push it a little bit. So, it seems to me, is it an implication of your view that if there was a creature that, although it had body or bodies, the body didn't matter to it? That's to say, it could use it for sensing, but it didn't actually care much about what happened to it because it could grow a new one at any time, or it had lots of them. That would be a kind of creature with perception, but not perceptual experience, because the experience bit somehow gets in because of bodily matter.
Experience. No, I absolutely.
Right. So that would be a kind of zombie.
Yeah. And I think we are such creatures.
See, that's a bit that I'm not quite getting, because I think we are such creatures, but that's, as it were, then why bother with the sensation side of the story?
Well, that's, of course, the question. That's partly what my story is designed to answer, because, if you take Jesse's view and just say, well, okay, it's on intermediate to perception, so had to be there anyway. Well, then, why do we find that level interesting and surprising and magical and so on? For me, it starts off with that was the level which actually was concerned with the self and with what this means to me, whereas on the whole, perception was trying to give a neutral description of what lies out there in real space. What we would share with any other observer in observing the environment.
Maybe that's a bit that's not so clear to me, that that's a neutral description, because it is a description, as it were, that we're going to move towards some of those states under some conditions, move away from other states. The idea, so I think what you're getting from the sensation side is, I think there's a phrase in the book about a form of representation preloaded with aboutness and intentionality. And I guess my question is, do you really need sensation to get yourself preloaded with aboutness?
No, I don't think I think, we could have been designed differently. I think it's a historical accident, of course, that this is the way it went. But as Patty says, you can't go back, and once you've on a particular route, you can't go back and start over again from scratch.
But it is your view that were we different in that respect, we would be zombie systems without any perceptual experience. It wouldn't just be
without any sensory experience. But I think in that respect, I think we are zombies. I don't think there's any difference when it comes to a lot of our thinking and our ratiocination and so on, which isn't exactly what would go on and does go on in an artificial intelligence system, for example, which happens not to have had this extra dimension added to it. It hasn't had it added to it because no designers have found it relevant to the project they were involved with. Nature did find it relevant to our project, and that's why we got it. Keith.
Just coming back to the evolutionary story. I mean, just for clarification, I think the distinction between sensation and perception puzzles some people, but am I right in thinking that it's not a sort of conceptual point that phenomenal consciousness must be about sensation rather than about perception? That's the way evolution has actually designed it. So it could have sort of souped up perceptual representations to make them magical, and then we wouldn't have. Then that would have been the source of a kind of phenomenal consciousness. But it just happens that it had these beings.
Yeah, but it could. I don't think it would have happened, Keith, because I don't think perception involves these this monitoring of motor action. Though Andy, of course, does up to a point.
But if for some reason, you know, it had been able to do that, I mean, that would have been another route to getting this sort of magical stuff in there. But you think that, you know, evolutionary, there was already these responses, and they became privatized, and they became monitored, and so that's how it happened. So it's not it's not a philosophical point that phenomenal consciousness involves sensation and perception. That's just how it's happened, and that's what we have. Yeah. So because I think maybe it sounds to some philosophers maybe as if, you know, you're saying it must be sensation and perception, and I think it's much more plausible. I think when you see it rooted in this evolution.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, I'm a natural scientist, at least in the beginning, so I'm interested in explaining why the things out there are there, not what exists in
I think
another,
understanding the motivation
another
in that
world,
way
yes.
makes it easier to.
You know, could I just ask a question about what you say in the book about the Penrose triangle as an analogy to sensation? The Penrose triangle, seen from a certain angle, it gives you roughly an impossible intentional object, and yet there's a real physical thing there. And your analogy is the real physical thing is the real thing that is the sensation, but somehow it appears to us when we monitor the brain as this impossible thing, and then you said, and that's where all these properties of quality. All right, so then I guess the question is, this first of all, it doesn't give you properties of, it only will account for those versions of qualia it looks like that appear as contents of some other kind of experience. And then I guess the other question, what's the, if you don't literally take this as an experience that can't be reduced physically of the Penrose triangle, like seeing the Penrose triangle, I hope I'm being clear, then what's the status of this experience itself? It turns into physical processing of various sorts, and I myself have no objection to this, but the intentional logic disappears at this point.
I'm not sure I do understand the question.
Well, no, but take the actual Penrose physical triangle, which really exists. We see it as this thing which is impossible. That's the intentional logic. And an illusionist will say, you know, we talk as though it's there, but it's not really there. All that's really there is the physical thing. But in some sense, the experience of the thing is there. And then we have to understand the experience. On your account, that sounds like the thing that is the sensation with the impossible properties is this intentional logic that doesn't really exist. What exists is the underlying physical thing.
And I think the impossibility can lie within the dimensions which we are familiar with from the real world, like time, for example. Now, I mean, time, you know, we all understand time. We all, I think, in the everyday experience, actually experience extended time, a way in which things seem to be present for longer than they instantaneously could be. Now, the magic of that is the magic of a dimension which we're familiar with, but which actually couldn't be expressed in the real world in the ways we find it.
And maybe it's just a question of clarification. In the seeing the Penrose triangle, we have the seeing, and then we have the impossible logic that is the intentional logic of that seeing. On your account, we've got the physical sensation, which in some sense the analogy would be appears as this impossible thing. What does it appear to? I'm not talking about the self, I'm talking about what is the analogy of the seeing experience which picks out this impossible thing.
Well, I think it's one of these little homunculi who are busy representing what's there and passing on information to the next.
Oh, okay. So but then you also imply that you've solved the hard problem of consciousness. But if you've now got this thing left over, that is the monitoring of the impossible intentional object, that it has to be shown that itself can be made physical.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, any solution to the hard problem of consciousness will make it not so hard. And of course, that's precisely what I'm trying to do, is to say what looks like a very hard problem. And you know, I'm absolutely happy to adopt David's terminology about it, partly because it matters so much to us that we are the centers of this mystery. We ourselves are embodiments of something which looks like something we could never explain. Now, the fact is, in explaining that by saying, well, actually, what we're doing is representing, and we know how to build representations into functional.
It seems, just real quickly, it would seem as though the problem just rearises, though, with the experience, because it seems, as I understand David Chalmers' position, he can run the hard problem argument, so you can run the Mary argument just for like seeing cats and dogs, or see, it doesn't require these special, initially impossible.
I kind of just quickly answer that, Dan. Yeah. I mean, in my book, I have a Mary. I have an Andromedan scientist who I'm assuming comes to Earth and starts trying to work out what's going on here. And this Andromedan scientist does examine the brains of human beings. And I say explicitly that, yeah, as she looks more and more at what's going on, she suddenly says, wow. So that's what it's going to be like for a human creature to experience the world in the way he or she does. The Andromedan has never yet experienced it, but she can predict exactly what we're going to say about it, how impressed we're going to be, what philosophy we're going to get engaged in, and so on.
Okay, now, Jesse, you had your hand up a long time ago.
So, first, I mean, I can't resist reveling in the lively discovery that you too don't read your email, because instead of replying to your commentator, you gave a canned talk. But putting that to one side, I want to pick up on a theme that came out in Patty's commentary about continuity, because I think one of the ways in which pressure can be put, and I really mean this in the spirit of clarification, on the account is when you see the tremendous continuity across species, and you start to reflect on the nature of consciousness, its neural correlates, but also its function, it seems most plausible as your starting place to think that consciousness is fundamentally about perception, about picking up information in the world. And then, of course, looking at deficit work, characteristically, and blind sight is exciting precisely because it's the anomaly. Normally, when we lose consciousness, what we lose is our capacity to respond to the perceptual information. What's not lost is sort of knowledge of the self. So it seems to me this linkage to the self, this linkage to sort of inner experience, these more lofty themes like meaning of life or the connection to art, which I think are extremely interesting, look like extremely unlikely functions for consciousness precisely because they're unique to our species. And when you start to reflect on how much we share with other creatures, it seems like these are add-ons that might have a lot to do with what came after the development of consciousness and not what consciousness is sort of fundamentally about.
Yeah, I actually don't think there is complete continuity. I think things change dramatically with human beings. I mean, not quite Dan Dennett also thinks that too. But of course, the precursors of this in other animals must be functional. And I've tried to argue that, I mean, let's discuss what kind of evidence could we see of these kinds of awesome events occurring in an animal's mind. What kind of evidence would we see of their presence, which we wouldn't see in an animal which doesn't? And in the book I make rather a lot of the ways in which some animals, but not others, seem to just revel in experience.
But you have this anecdote of the chimp putting its hands in the water, but that stuff has not been systematically looked at.
Yes, it has actually. No, there's a lot of examples of that, and in fact, we now know how the meme spread from Gombe. Lots of other chimps copied it. It started within one family, and then everyone else discovered what fun it is to play in the water and watch the play of the sunlight on the ripples and so on. So we know it's beginning to be explored systematically. And I'm sorry if you thought that was a canned talk. It was actually. And I thought that for some, at least, of the audience here, it would be useful to use some pictures instead of responding at quite at an immediate level, which Patty was discussing it. But also, I think, I hope I was actually following on. I mean, from the place she gave me to begin with, anyway.
Shall we break at this point for lunch?